just to stay with the metaphor of the predator just for a while longer and try to apply it to therapy, or what therapy might mean, and using the word predator as a metaphor, because we don't mean predator in an absolute sense, because in that case it would be like talking about Satan and how we have to watch out for him because he's so bad. So in that case we would be playing right into the predator's hands, because as soon as we start taking the predator literally, that's exactly what the predator wants, even though the predator doesn't really want it, not literally, because there is no such thing as a literal predator. But all the same, if we do take the notion literally and start to strategize and work out what we can do to escape from the predator or defeat the predator or whatever it is, then we've lost straight away. The predator is won straight away, even though there is no literal predator. So, at the risk of confusing things, I think it is important just to start off by saying that. So, whenever we talk about the predator, just to remember that the predator is a metaphor, that's all. In therapy, the predator really comes into his own. That's where he really has a field day. And in general, we can say that whenever we want to change ourselves, for whatever reason, that's when the predator has a field day. And the reason for that is because whenever we want to change ourselves, that necessarily means that we are entertaining an idea or thought about how we should be, or what it is we think we ought to be. So we're having an idea of what that improvement would be that we want to bring about. And the key thing here is to realize that when we're talking about improvement, we're talking about an idea of ourselves as being in some way better, obviously, than the way we already are. And if we do have an idea of how we could improve ourselves, that means we've wandered into the realm of thought without actually realizing it. We've gone into the world of thought. As soon as we have any idea of ought to have, ought to, or have to, or should, all of these are the vocabulary of thought, and we've wandered into the realm of thought, which basically means that the predator is eating us. We've handed ourselves over on a plate, and the predator's there with his knife in one hand and fork in the other, and he's sprinkling a bit of salt and pepper on us, and he's gobbling us up. He's having us for dinner. As soon as we try and improve ourselves or change ourselves in any way, and that's kind of a tricky thing, because as we understand it, therapy is all about changing ourselves. If we were to ask anyone, they would probably say, yes, therapy is how we change ourselves from being away, which isn't good, to being away. That's better. That's a better way. So straight away there is that fundamental mistake in our thinking. And the same, of course, applies to spirituality. As soon as we think about how we could be more spiritual people instead of being the way that we are, straight away we're playing into the hands of the predator. The predator loves that kind of stuff. So then straight away we've lost. Even though we might think we're actually becoming more spiritual, which is a funny kind of a thing. But it does nevertheless happen a lot, whether it's a funny kind of thing or not. And we can shift from the metaphor of the predator to the metaphor of the giant amoeba, just to make that a little bit clearer, because the giant amoeba is the predator as well, just another way of looking at the predator and how the predator operates. So sticking just for a moment or two within this realm of spirituality, or we could call it pseudo-spirituality, really. This is the realm we go into any time we have an idea of being somehow spiritually improved. Now, as soon as we have this idea, that means that we must have an idea of what it means to be spiritually improved. We must have some sort of notion of it. Otherwise, how could we possibly make a goal of it or have an inclination towards it? Because we can't. Got to have some kind of idea of what it means to be spiritually improved. So we have this idea, and then the giant amoeba takes this idea and makes it for us. So then we live within our own idea, or within the simulation of what it means to be spiritually improved, even though it's just another thought. So we're going around being the new improved, spiritually improved version of ourselves, which is something that we've thought of beforehand. So it's kind of like another room in the same house. There's lots of rooms in this house. We've moved to another room, but it's still the house of thought. It's still the system of thought. But we're quite excited about it because it's improved, the new improved spiritual way of being. But anything that is based on us wanting to be different from the way that we actually are is an illusory projection. And whatever practices we engage in order to be different from the way that we are, is also an illusory projection. So the amoeba has a field day because it is providing us with all these simulations of what we imagine to be more spiritual, which is a funny kind of a thing, because how on earth would we know what it means to be more spiritual? If we can know it or have an idea about it, that means it's not spiritual at all. It's just an extension of what we already understand. It's like devout religious folk going on about heaven. Heaven is just a projection of the way they already understand things. It's a projection of the same house of thought, another room in the same house of thought. So we keep on trying to become more spiritual, and the amoeba keeps on producing the simulated realities that correspond to our notions of what it means to be more spiritual, and that goes on forever. Which explains why it's so incredibly, why it is such an incredibly difficult thing once we do take on this notion to live a spiritual life rather than an ordinary crappy old life, because we're flirting with all these mind-produced hallucinations of what that means. We don't even notice ourselves imagining what does it mean to be more spiritual, but we are imagining it anyway. We have some kind of notion about it, and the notion that we have about it is exciting because it seems great, but it's only a notion, and there's no way by any kind of doing that we can get anywhere different, that we can get away from the thinking mind. So just as Wei Wu Wei says all methods are the I concept, we could say that all doing, all purposeful action is the I concept, and we can never escape the I concept. The I concept is simply inventing new ways of looking at itself, more glamorous ways of looking at itself. The I concept wants to be glamorous and enjoys being glamorous. And there's great glamour in spirituality. There's nothing as glamorous as that. There's nothing as seductive as that. So as soon as we imagine that we have reached some stage that is an improvement, spiritually speaking, to our ordinary modality of existence, we've just fashioned a better trap for ourselves. And we're going to end up validating ourselves, putting all our energy into validating ourselves as having reached this spiritual stage that is superior to how we were before. And that's no different from being stuck in an ego that is trying to validate itself as being special, which is, of course, the whole mechanism of being an ego. So it's the same old thing that we're talking about, really. The I concept wants to have some glamorous reality for itself. Spirituality offers that possibility and allows the I concept to reinvent itself over and over again. But we know this isn't in any way genuine, because anything that comes about because of the I concept is quintessentially non-spiritual. There's no such thing as a spiritual I concept. There's no such thing as a spiritual ego. There is such a thing as a spiritual fantasy by the ego of itself as more than just the poor old everyday ego, which, as we know, is not that glamorous at all, really. So in this case, when we start trying to change ourselves in any way, we are food for the predator. If we see the way that we are as being a way of being that is subject to the rule of the predator, and we see ourselves as being outmaneuvered by the predator or held captive by the predator, and we want to do something about this state of affairs to be free from the predator, we could call the predator the ego in this case, then that's giving the predator power. So that's all we're saying, really. Any methodology at all that we embark upon. So coming back to therapy, we can see that this is very tricky indeed, because we're absolutely desperate to improve ourselves, because the way that we are is so very painful. It's crying out to be different. It's crying out for improvement. Everything in us wants to be not suffering in the way that we are suffering. So this need facilitates an idea of ourselves as being a bad way. So we could say the idea that we have of ourselves is pathological, i.e., I'm sick, I'm unwell, I'm broken. So that's an idea that we have of ourselves, a serious idea. I mean, we have that idea and it's like sinks us straight away because it's like, oh no, I'm so broken. So that's the predator. As soon as we have an idea about ourselves or how we are that we believe in, we've been predated. On the other hand, when we have an idea of how we'd like to be and we project a more idealized vision of what we're aiming at, where we get to feel better about ourselves, or we get to feel more empowered or more at peace, we have an idealized projection of ourselves feeling more peaceful or less distressed or less guilty, we're also being predated because these idealized images are provided for us by the predator. So the bad way that we are, the thought of the bad way that we are is the predator when we believe it, and the thought of the good way that we could be or that we'd like to be or that we believe we can be if we take the appropriate steps, that's also the predator. So we can visualize this, that we are there, and the predators, they're waiting for us to have some idea about either how bad we are or how good it would be to be something different. And as soon as we do either of those two things, we get eaten up. Our essential energy gets devoured by this terrible creature that's always one step ahead of us. In fact, this terrible creature that is our own mind, even though we can't see it, even though we can't see that. So we use our own mind to escape from the predator, and our own mind is the predator. So that's never going to work out. But we can't see that it's never going to work out. To see that is beyond most of us. It's too slippery a perception. And the demand that it makes upon us is too difficult, because where do we turn? How do we act, or how do we be in such a way as not to play into the predator's hands? In other words, to be free from the predator, to actually exist, to actually be. Because where all our pain comes from is the pain of not being. We have existence, but only within the terms of the mind simulation. And existence within the terms of the mind simulation, which is the amoeba's representation of us, can be two ways. It can be euphoric, in which case it's a pleasant prison, or it can be dysphoric, an unpleasant prison. We can feel good about ourselves or bad about ourselves, but the self we're feeling good about or bad about isn't us. But whichever way we do feel about ourselves when we are existing as the mind simulation of who we are, that is suffering, because whenever we get to exist as the mind simulation of who we are, that means that we have no connection with who we are, and that lack of connection, that alienation from our true being, is the most quintessential form of suffering. So the euphoric self-image is suffering, pleasure is suffering, as Wei Wu Wei says. It's suffering we don't recognize as suffering. It's suffering that we think is good and we keep coming back for second helpings. I'll have some more of that because that was quite nice. I think I'll go for some more of that, but we wouldn't do that if we could see that it was suffering. So in this case, if we can see that we facilitate the predator by trying to be different from the way that we are, then what that means is we become invulnerable to the predator if we don't have any idea about the way that we are, which we really don't need to have. It's not essential to have an idea about ourselves and how we are and whether we're broken or not broken, healthy or unhealthy. It's not necessary to have an idea about ourselves. And it's not necessary to have an idea about how we'd like to be or how we think we should be or how we think we ought to be. All of these are little itches that are given to us by the thinking mind. So the way not to fall into the trap that is laid for us by the predator is simply for us to be the way that we actually are, whatever way that is, without having any notion that we shouldn't be that way, and without having any notion that there's steps we can take to change that way. And this doesn't really equate to accepting ourselves as the way, in terms of how we usually understand accepting ourselves, because normally we say, accept yourself. You think, okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to perform this act, which is called accepting myself. And if I do that, that'll be good. That'll be the thing to do. So that's the new rule that I will obey. So I've got a thought that it's good to accept myself. And there is this thing called accepting myself. And if I do it, that's the right thing to do. So I've turned it all into rules. And turning something into rules is the same as turning it into thoughts. But actually, what we tend to call in a very sloppy way accepting ourselves happens before any movement of thought, because there's no need to do it. There's no need for any action to be performed. It's not a thing we do. It's a thing that we be. We're already being ourselves. That's the one thing we don't need to strain for. That's the one thing we don't need to try and contrive in some way. So it's not an action. An action implies that there's where I am right now, which is not the right place, and where I'm aiming to be, which is the right place, and my action will take me from here to there. And it's not like that. Acceptance isn't like that. So there's no need for any thought, any formation of ideas of what a goal is, what's a good place and what's a bad place. So if we can remain subtle enough in ourselves to stay with the experience of whatever's going on without going into this movement of thought, then we are free from the predator, immune to the predator's tricks. Okay, thanks for watching.